Hi, today's talk is called Social Media, Censorship, and Sinai. The question being that when you have a social platform, what are the obligations from the point of view of the Torah, from the point of view of Jewish wisdom and lore sourced mainly on Talmudic texts? How do we view our right to free speech and balance that with our obligation to help other people and protect them? And this is actually a very timely conversation, and that's because right now we find ourselves in a period of time called the 3 weeks on the Jewish calendar throughout the year. So there are many holidays, Passover and Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah, various days that celebrate kind of epochs in Jewish history and the cycle of the year and the harvest and things like that. And then there are various historical events. So the 3 weeks is a period of time of mourning that began this past Sunday, and it continues on for 3 weeks until Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the month of Av, which is when the both holy temples in Jerusalem, there were holy temples which were the epicenter of Jewish life, were destroyed. Both of them were destroyed on the same day, several hundred years apart, on the 9th of Av. And so the Talmud brings a story and says, why is it that this temple was destroyed? Obviously, there were larger things at play in terms of, the Roman control of the land and things like that. But there was also, the Talmud views, there was a kind of an issue within the Jewish community that needed to be addressed. And that is the issue of Lashon Hara, of people speaking negatively about each other, and Sinat Chinam, and needless hate of other people. And I think that fits very nicely with this idea of social media, because these are platforms where people are sharing things and putting things online, and they are rife with the potential for negative speech and needless hate. And therefore, I think this kind of fits together. So the story in the Talmud that kind of anchors this around the holiday, it goes as follows. So it happened this way. A certain man had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. Kamsa could mean a turtle, perhaps, or it's a last name in this case. Bar Kamsa could be the son of Kamsa. So either you're speaking about a father and a son, or two people that at the very least have very similar names. So he once made a party, and he said to a servant, "Go and bring Kamsa." The man went and brought Bar Kamsa. So he was supposed to bring his best friend, and instead of his bestie coming, it becomes his number one enemy. And now he has a disaster because he's thrown the biggest, party on the scene in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and this person that he cannot stand comes in. So when the man who gave the party found Bar Kamsa there, he said, "So you are my enemy. What are you going to do? What are you doing here? Get out." So said the other, this Bar Kamsa says, "1 second, I'm here, I got dressed up, I came out, what should I do? Since I'm already here, let me stay, and I'll pay for whatever I eat and drink, you don't have to worry, it's not going to cost you anything, I'll cover the cost of my food." Said the host, "Absolutely not. The host wouldn't hear from it. I do not want this guy in my presence." But there's a level of shame here, right? You're at this party where everyone is there to see and be seen, and he's being kicked out. So he says, "Let me cover half the cost of the party. I'll cover half the cost, whatever it is. Preserve my dignity." The host refused. "Let me pay for the whole party." Still, the host refused and took him by the hand and threw him out. Said Bar Kamsa, "Since the rabbis are sitting there and did not stop him, this shows that they agreed with him. I will go and inform against them to the government." He went and said to the emperor, "The Jews are rebelling against you." And therefore, the Talmud places this divisive act, this lack of unity that existed amongst the people between each other, as the source for whatever destruction came about afterwards. And therefore, we're not going to analyze this scene in a lot of detail. I think there's actually a class I gave a couple of years ago that, I don't know if it's still on the servers or it's around, that kind of analyzes this particular moment more. But suffice it to say, we see over here that not treating each other properly has real ramifications in the world. And therefore, what is the obligation of people to kind of make sure that things we say are fair? So let's start with the idea that in Judaism, speech is considered to be an action of sorts. That there's a power of speech, and we have obligations to make sure that the things we say don't damage and hurt other people. And this comes from the Bible itself, that says, "You shall not wrong one man his fellow Jew, and you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God." That you shouldn't do anything wrong. We're going to discuss what that means in a moment. But generally speaking, whenever you see in the Torah, the sages say, why is it that sometimes you'll have it'll say, "Don't do this," and it says you should fear God. What does that mean? What's that connection? Obviously, you should always fear God. Fear to here doesn't mean that, you're worried about being struck by a lightning bolt, since that tends not to happen. But it means that you should have an awe and a sense of like, how could I do this wrong in the face of the omnipotent, creator. So the reason is because sometimes there are things where the Torah says you shouldn't do this, but we can't enforce a punishment on it. Maybe because we don't know the intent, right? And maybe sometimes you could say something to somebody and it seems very innocent to everyone around, but you know that you're hurting the person, and the person knows you're hurting the person. But we don't know your intent. If you did it, maliciously, or you did it innocently. So therefore, it says that God knows what's going on in your mind, and therefore your intent and what's going on is known, and therefore there's still a spiritual ramification to this idea of speech, even if we can't necessarily provide a certain, physical punishment or fine or things like that necessarily. But so Rashi, who is the kind of foundational commentator on the entire Torah, says here Scripture is warning against wronging verbally, namely that one must not provoke his fellow, nor may one offer advice to him that is unsound for him, but according to the mode of life or the benefit of the advisor. You can't take advantage of someone. You can't tell somebody, hey, invest in this stock because you know that you're going to do well, but that person is going to lose out because you're going to short it or whatever it is. Our speech is considered a form of action, and therefore we have an obligation from the point of view of Judaism to make sure that our speech doesn't damage someone else. So to develop this just a little bit further, there is a work called the Chinuch. The Chinuch is written by an anonymous 13th century sage from Barcelona. We know his name was Aaron, and he was from the tribe of Levi, but we don't know which Aaron Halevi it was. But he wrote this work that kind of takes all the commandments and explains them all. So he says, we are commanded to not mistreat any Israelite with words. I mean, to say that one not say to an Israelite words that hurt him or cause him pain, and doesn't have the strength to be helped by them. An explanation of the rabbis, may their memory be blessed, said, how is it if he was a penitent, he should not say to him, remember your previous deeds? We have a few more examples over here. If ailments are coming upon him, should not say to him in the way that Job's friends spoke, it is not your reverence, your confidence, etc., that cause these maladies to fall upon you. And about this is stated, a man should not mistreat his fellows. So basically, what's an example of negative speech? To embarrass somebody, to say, your background isn't, so high and mighty, because in the case of somebody who's a convert, right? Then you're going to say, oh, maybe we shouldn't view that person as a fellow Jew. No, you have to treat them as a full-fledged member of the Jewish community. If you're going to remind them of their mistakes, if a person, messed up in the past and they truly repented, right? And to start embarrassing that person needlessly, it's not about warning and things like that, but needlessly embarrass people. So that's also an issue. Or if somebody's having a hard time and say, oh, you deserve it, because I know what you did. I know. Any of these things are examples of speech that we are forbidden from doing. So the question is, am I responsible for the actions of others? So all this is to say that in Judaism, and we'll discuss this more, later on, but there's a real difference between the way Judaism views the importance of our actions, so to speak, and the way secular society does. And the basic breakdown is, do we view things as centered on obligations? The Judaism has an obligation first point of view, that it's about my obligation to do right, my obligation to protect you, my obligation to not mistreat you, as opposed to the secular society, which views us as having rights, so to speak. I have the right to do this, I have the right to do that. And therefore, we're going to see the implications is actually end up creating, some different scenarios. So now we're going to kind of get into the question of social networks themselves, right? Because here we have platforms where people can go online and they could say whatever they want. They can and do the social. When I'm on any social network, right, I have an obligation to speak properly, to say the right thing. As a rabbi, I've learned that sometimes even if I make a joke on Twitter or whatever it is, people say, "Oh, thanks, Rabbi." I'm like, "Oh, wow," and I didn't mean it that way, but you have, I have an obligation to present my best face forward, and each and every one of you and everyone in the world has the obligation. But what about the people who make the platforms, right? Do they have an obligation to do something, or can they just say, you have your obligation, it's not our problem? Can they kind of step back? So there are three potential issues that come into play when it comes to how a social network could view this idea of, are they just a common carrier, as it were, or do they have an obligation to step in? A general preface: this is not about actual acts that can cause imminent harm. If there's terrorist activity or real harm to people, that then there's a clear need to step in and take action. But the question is, what about those vaguer things, the vagaries of speech that can be viewed as negative or cannot be? Is that an issue? So the first issue is this idea of creating a stumbling block. So the Torah says, you shall not place a stumbling block before a blind person, and you shall fear your God, I am the Lord. So this is another example of something that doesn't quite have a clear thing, but literally, if a blind person is walking, you can't put a crate in front of them or something like that and cause them to stumble. But the Talmud views this in a broader sense. The Talmud views this as, you can't give somebody something that is forbidden for them and will cause them harm. So maybe like a slightly more secular example, if you have an alcoholic in your house, right? You cannot give them, a drink, because if you're giving them a drink, that will cause them harm and that will cause them damage, and therefore you're not allowed to do that. The second issue is aiding and abetting, meaning that you're not causing this person harm by doing something, but can you be somebody who works along with them? So the second issue of aiding and abetting, an example would be traditionally when you had tailors, right? So you'd go to the tailor, in the past, you'd bring a bunch of cloth that you bought in the market, and the tailor would make a suit to fit you, and there was always those little scraps left over. So technically, according to Jewish law, those scraps have to be returned to the person who ordered the suit, right? I bought, 10 meters of cloth, and therefore I wanted, these clothes made for me, and whatever's left over should go back to me. But the tailors would often, being a tailor wasn't a great job, right? So they would kind of take some on the side and things like that. Another example was, say someone is making yarn. So you bring them a whole bale of wool, and they comb it. And when they're the process of combing out the wool, there are little bits and pieces that are left over. Those little bits and pieces, in theory, should be returned. Now, what happens if the person combing the wool takes that wool and then puts it in a pillow and now wants to sell the pillow? So in theory, those are stolen goods over there. Are you allowed to help them or not? Broadly speaking, when it comes to aiding and when it comes to stealing something in Jewish law, if there is a substantive change to the item, it can be permissible to buy, right? So in theory, if I go to a guy who sells pillows and he also combs wool, and sometimes he buys the little bits of wool that are left over, and sometimes he just kind of pockets it on the side and whatever it is, then I could buy a pillow from him because it's been completely changed from its original state. It's not little bits of wool. It's not become a pillow. It's a whole new object. I'm not doing it. But if the guy says, hey, do you want to come over here and help me comb this wool and let's, kind of sneak it on the side, at that point in time, I know that there's an illicit activity going on. If somebody steals wood and says, do you want to help me take this wood and make planks, right? Even though once the planks are made, the rules of stealing aren't quite the same. I'm not allowed to get involved in that because I know that this person has nefarious intent behind it, and therefore I'm not allowed to do it. So this could be the second issue in theory, right? That you're aiding and abetting something, that by creating a platform, you're giving someone the tools to be able to do something wrong, to be able to say destructive things. We'll get that in a moment, but what's this idea of aiding and abetting? When an object undergoes a change in the craftsman's possession, it is permitted to purchase it. It is, however, forbidden for any person to aid the thief in altering the stolen article, for by changing it, he's removing it from the domain of the owner and causing it to be acquired by the thief. This is considered to be an assisting a transgressor. So for this idea of combing the wool, that we know that through that action, you're creating that pillow that's going to be a different thing, or you're carving the planks of wood. So even though once it becomes the planks, it is now a new thing, and therefore someone else could buy it. If you're actively involved in that, you're actively involved in this transgression. So that's kind of the second potential issue. And finally, the third thing is, those other two are about my involvement. The third thing is if you witness something. The Torah says you shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. I'm the Lord. That if somebody is being hurt, not just physically, but embarrassed or whatever it is, we have an obligation to speak up. We have an obligation to do something about it, to be proactive and try and step in. So therefore, I want to analyze these three things and see how they would fit a little bit better in the case of social media. And there's a difference, of course, as social media has changed today. So the first idea is the stumbling block. So what is the stumbling block? Literally, you read the Torah, somebody reads Leviticus, they're just going to say, oh, you can't put a box in front of a blind person and cause them to trip. How does that fit into this idea of causing somebody to make a mistake? So the classic example that's brought in the Talmud very often is this idea of a Nazarite, somebody who says, I've partied way too much and it's gone too wild. I'm not going to have any more wine. I'm not going to have any more grape products. He's going to grow his hair long. And refrain from coming in contact with dead people. It's to lead a more spiritually separated life. So therefore, this idea of a Nazarite is not allowed to have wine. Can I hand wine to the Nazarite? Right. From where is derived, the person may not extend a cup of wine to Nazarite, who is prohibited from drinking. The verse states, and you shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. But if one does not give it to him, he could take it himself, and yet the one who provides it to him transgresses the prohibition. You shall not put a stumbling block before the blind. So therefore, if there's if I invite a bunch of people over to my house and there's wine on the table, So I could say that theoretically, listen, they're the Nazarite, this person will use the case of an alcoholic, because I think it's a little bit easier to use today. I put a bunch of wine on the table, I invite an alcoholic to my house. That person, I'm not offering the guy a drink, right? There's soda on the table. If there was no soda or no non-alcoholic options, that'd be an issue. But if I have a diversity of drinks, then I haven't caused that person to stumble, because I've given that person the choice to choose whatever they do, right? And therefore, but if I say, hey, this one's on me, and I hand him a drink, that becomes a problem. So from the point of view of a social network, they could say that we have, we're not actively handing you, causing you to do this thing over there. We're just creating a platform that exists, and therefore we can't say from a Torah point of view that from creating a stumbling block, we're not causing people to err. People want to say something destructive. They want to, maledict people. There are many other ways out there that exist, right? Any one social network could say, well, there's another one out there. Monopoly discussion aside, but in theory, these, all these, there are other platforms you can go to, and if not, you could still take a paper and pencil and make a bunch of photocopies and put the flyers all over the place. There are many ways a person to do it. So therefore, from that point of view, from the point of view of this particular issue of creating a stumbling block, we can't say that a social network is creating a stumbling block for people, because they're not. You're actually handing the person the tools to do it, because they exist in many different. There are other ways for the person to do something wrong. Just this idea here, we're dealing with a case where they're standing on the two sides of a river, and therefore the recipient could not have taken it himself. So the Nazarite alcoholic, since his help was instrumental, the one who conveyed the item, has violated the prohibition of putting a stumbling block before him. That this person, when it's an issue, when this person doesn't have access to it, right? In the middle of a river, and you're going to reach from one bank and reach the middle of the river and hand it to him, he wouldn't be able to get otherwise. But if he's on the same bank as you, if he has access to it, he could just go to a store and buy drinks whatever he wants. It's not a problem. So that's that idea. What about aiding and abetting? What about the fact that we are not actively causing a person to do something, but still you're creating a platform that allows people to do it, right? And do it at scale. They could say horrible things. They could hurt. They could cause real, damage to people from the point of view that speech is damage, at an incredible scale. Maybe just the fact that these platforms exist, that's a problem. That would be aiding and abetting, because you're giving them the tool to be able to do it. You're not incentivizing them to do it, but you are, creating a place where they can do it. So the example that we're going to use over here to look at this is the question of, can you sell things to somebody they're going to do something that's not allowed? So the example is, what happens if I sell pots? I know someone's going to come and they're going to create, a non-kosher dish and cook it in that pot. Am I not allowed to sell them a pot? The pot is totally neutral. The pot is fine. Someone could buy a pot, could buy a stove, could buy all the different things. That's not a problem. I don't know that they're going to cook them together. Is that an issue or not? What happens if I do know that theoretically they could do it? So this comes from Rabbi Mordechai Feinstein, who was one of the great 20th century rabbis who ruled a lot on cases that came up in America. And he speaks about this particular issue. So furthermore, it is logical to suggest that there's no prohibition of abetting a transgressor when there's no possibility of creating a stumbling block. The issue of abetting would only apply if you're giving something that was explicitly used in a transgression, that you're giving something that can actively be used as a tool to be able to do it. But if the item being given is generally permissible for use, it's fine. Otherwise, it would be forbidden to sell anything ever to someone who transgresses. Even selling a pot would be forbidden unless it be used to cook on Shabbat or to prepare non-kosher food. Rather, since the primary use isn't for something forbidden, there's no prohibition of abetting. Since there's no direct stumbling block created through these actions, it's fine. So you could say a social network there as well. Since I'm not actively enticing the person to do it, there's not a problem. All this is speaking about, by the way, when social media was just a raw feed, right? Why? Because today, now that we have algorithmically, it incentivizes us to do things, right? And we know sometimes the more extreme speech out there often, gets more feedback, and especially with those like partner programs, people make money off of it. It becomes this kind of loop that reinforces things. That actually becomes a problem. So there's not a solid, Talmudic dictate to say that, whatever it is, but we've left the zone of creating that neutral pot, because at this point in time, we're not just saying, here's a pot to buy and cook whatever you want. We're saying, here's a pot, and here's some pork, and here's some cheese, and here's some whatever it is, and we're going to pay you to do it. So the fact that today we no longer have social networks that just share what you do, but that the algorithm actually suggests and leads you that direction, enters at least, at the very least, a gray zone from the point of view of Jewish law. We have to take into real consideration about what we're doing, because we're no longer just, creating this neutral platform where the person could buy a drink anywhere they want. We've now created a system that is really pointing that person in that direction and incentivizing them to go there. And that leads to the final thing that do not stand idly by. This commandment applies when a person sees his fellow drowning at sea or being attacked by robbers or wild animal, and he can save himself or can hire others to save him. Similarly, it applies when he hears informers conspiring to harm a colleague or planning to snare him, and he does not inform him and notify him of the danger. That what happens if you see somebody drowning, and this person knows how to swim? Do I have to jump in? Yes, I do have to jump in. If I see somebody is being attacked, and okay, there's an axe over there, maybe pick it up and try and fight them off, you still have to step in. Meaning just because somebody could battle their way out of the situation, we have an obligation to step in and to try and do something to help that person and be more proactive and not just passively watch that person kind of go through the throes of if they're going to be able to succeed or not. And therefore, it would seem that when it comes to social media, there might be an obligation on us as well as individuals at the very least. And theoretically, if you're creating a corporation that has that Jewish value involved in it, to proactively do something, try and help the situation. And it applies when a person knows an idolater or a strongman who is grudging his fellow. I mean, this is kind of the same idea, all the various analogous cases that comes up, and you have to take an action. So I want to zoom out finally and kind of look at, all this fits very nicely into the Jewish sense of things as opposed to the secular thing. Why? Because the reality is we never addressed, the right to free speech. In America, the right to free speech is enshrined in the Constitution. There's no right to free speech in Judaism. That doesn't mean that, people can't say things. Obviously, you walk into yeshiva, you walk into a study hall in this class, please argue with me when we'll be done in a moment and tell me why you think I'm wrong and why you think there's better things. That rigorous debate is encouraged and essential to being able to refine the concept and to be able to delve deeper and to be able to better understand. If you don't have that argument, then you're never going to be able to see what's going on. At the same time, even when you have that rigorous debate, there's also an obligation from the Jewish point of view to make sure that you're respecting the other person, that you're not harming them in that way and things like that. And therefore, we kind of end up having two different views in how we view the world. So Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late chief rabbi of England, put it this way. The Bible is more concerned with cultivating habits of responsibility than merely prescribing rights. Rights are legislated by states. Responsibility is created by society. You're going to have one without the other. A system of rights must be accompanied by a culture of responsibility. And therefore, he views the two of these things when you're speaking about kind of the marriage between the Jewish ethos and the secular world ethos. Each one is important, but that when you're viewing from the Jewish point of view, the obligation begins with you. From a secular point of view, you have the state, you have this great thing, and we're kind of, zooming in and creating limits on what a person could do. From the Jewish point of view, it starts with me. I have to look at myself and I have to say what I'm doing. Is it helping someone? Is it proactively making the world a better place? That's my obligation. I start with my obligation, my duty to myself, to my family, to my community, to my country, and to my creator ultimately, and I zoom outwards from there.